George Larson, Philip George Arnett, Ralph Anderson, Adolph Britzen, Helmer Johnson, William Kingsley, George Knox, Joseph Losel, Herman Meanert, Harry Ramsdell, Frank Sheldon, Helmer Peterson, Roy Burr, Jorgen Jorgensen, Elmer Eckert, John Carlson, Irving Kingsley, Joseph Safner, Raymond Peterson, John Johnson, Wilfred Burr, Otis Foss, Harry Lewis Smith, Alvin Almquist, Robert Gordon, John Vetch, Jacob, Jake McCune, Irvin Nash, Arthur Wallen, Arthur Anderson, Alfred Erickson, Olaf Johnson, Roy Loken, Grant Redding, Laverne Sen, Lyle Hahn, Lars Lewis, Chester Ruland, Frida Ortley Lynn, Oscar Peterson, Lauren Llewellyn, Norman Paulson, Martin Denstad, Stanley Halverson, Raymond Curtis Arnett, David Comstock, Edwin Olson, Hans Peterson, Glenn Foss, Ralph Olson, Wilfred Quinnett, James Henry Rue III, John Fitting Jr., Philip Layton, Elmer Benson, Ruth Flay, Walter Anderson, Herbert Ronenberg, Guy Gordon Swenson, George Shapel, Gilbert Sheepstead, James Steele, Dale Poppy, Edward Vadding, Henry Anderson, Earl Grenier, Kendall Halverson, Henry Loken, Melvin Olson, Adolph Tulfson, Nels Lee, Palmer Peterson, Edward Radke, Maurice Lee, Tinas Olson, Carl Jedrum, Fern Sackett, Odin Selvig, Oscar Carlston, Olaf Mullerstedt, George Munns, Gerald Jerry Sackett, Fred Solberg, Alan Brumseth.
Martin Breivik, Gerald Kittleson, Louis Laugen, Eddie Peterson, John Kittleson, Lawrence Miller, Siegfried Mosby, Edward Ed Sandin, Nick Sweet, Walter Thompson, Joel Joe Eglund, Herbert Hansen, Viggo Olson, Henry Sorum, Leonard Hansen, Edward Mohn, Lloyd Thompson, Tullif Tullifson, Charles Hahn, John Hauge, William Willie Johnson, Harold Poppy, Roy Schnaufer, Orvin Skifton, Lyle Sweet, Kenneth Virak, Harry Wilcox, Henry Hill, Joseph Huffman, Leon Nelson, Helmer Odegarden, Arthur Ronenberg, Hamden Corey, Kenneth Hageland, Herbert Hill, Palmer Nelson, George Evenson, Orson Flatt, Anton Norskog, Arthur Peterson, Clarence Strand, Alfred Sweet, Melvin Wilson, Charles Benson, Armin Bergskard, Alton Forsythe, Clarence Johnson, Robert Milne, John Nelson, Earl Sheepstead, Clarence Wilson, Arlo Abraham, Kenneth Loken, Harold Peralt, Earl Dvork, John Denstead, Lowell Engelhart, William Fowles, Glenn Halverson, Thomas James Sweet, Morris Westby, Walter Chandler, John Comstock, Rollin Fitting, Peter Gousted, Stanley Holte, John Edward McManaman, Solvi Morkan, Martin Sievertson, Clarence Witt, Paul Baumgardner, Martin Esker, Kenneth Sen, Paul Soberg, Peter Wisland, Miles Abramson, Martin Ellefson, Arthur Nelson, John Refsland, Arvid Swenson, Stanley Abramson, Victor Anderson, John Dooner, Daryl Dyer.
Bernard Engelhart, Rudolf Poppel, Theodore Peter Jorgensen, Muriel Lee, Thor Sandin, Kenneth Treescutter, Edward Botcher, Eugene Buckles, Lawrence Flatham, Fergus Hoppel, Sidney Johnson, William Keefe, Roland Rank, Joseph Wolters, Alan Carlson, Artie Johnson, Alida Kelly, Obert Nelson, Robert Newland, Adolph Olson, Oscar Birkland, Henry Christensen, Elmer England, Ernest Halverson, Frederick Botcher, Omar Holden, Lawrence Ole Ives, Steve Ahmet, Leroy Snow, Gerald Waring, Melvin Hansen, Verdane Heinz, Louis Kingsley, Richard Moreau, Clarence Muley, Arnold Peterson, Horace Hal Campbell, Ralph Hoppel, Howard Johnson, John Crumry, John Sandeau, Oscar Virak, Hilton Happy Green, Henry Hansen, Dr. Harold Kramer, Betty Murphy, Norman Norris, Basil Winch, Bob Bedore, Donald Gausted, Vernon Jacobson, Ole Thorson, Frank Todd, Arthur Vining, Alfred Ellefson, Elmer Flatham, Harold Lehman, Stanley Hahn, Carl Halverson, Simeon Leslie, Harris Loken, William Babler, Clifton Gausted, Gerald Kelly, Ricky Peterson, Larry Anderson, Laverne Ives, Erling Kildall, Cleo Poppenfuss, Donald Richmond, Marion Tiny Poppenfuss, Oscar Sieverton, Laurel Erickson, Stanley Fitting, Carl Forsythe, Claude Kramer, Tilbert Loken, Arthur Art Peterson, Wade Schultz, Ingold Sorum, John Sievermer, Theo Glib Hauser, Paul G. Iverson, Arthur Janison.
Sam Spurbeck, Milton Duffy, Wayne Ellefson, Anton Foss, Regional Hairsted, Glenn Hauge, Howard Lee, David Lilly, Orville Paulson, Aldous Swenson, William Webbles, Vernon Hebner, Brent Ingvoldson, Floyd Loken, James Sanders, Daniel Trunson, Virgil Benson, Norman Benson, Donald Evenson, Glenn Smith, Kenneth Williams, Wayne Benson, Joyce Benson, Arnold Flom, Gerald Gausted, Emil Hansen, Vernon James, Lyndon Johnson, Chris Miller, Maynard Nelson, John Rowitter, Ralph Schild, Elmer Vadding, Edward Walsh, Lawrence Kruger, Bob Laux, Warren Swenson, Ernest Walker, J. Michael Crossman, Silas Dolly, Anthony Feldmeyer, Donald George, Lloyd Hanford, Glenn Kerrigan, Leroy Lederber, Erna Peterson, Larry Rosfold, Delbert Smith, Joseph Colson, Ellsworth Erickson, Thomas Glamsky Sr., Albert Sherry, Darrell Scray, Melvin Thompson, Sherman Anderson, Lloyd Johnson, Charles Chuck Hansen, LaWayne Harold, Harold Herb Johnson, Henry McCune, John George, Marvin Loken, Carlton Onskard, Wallace Wally Hawn, James Hill, Armand Korthauer, Jimmy Loken, James Meeks, Dennis Shoemaker, Nathan Sherry, John Carlson, Elvin Jorgensen, James Palama, Ivy Poppenwell, Eli Schilling, James Jim Skadson, Orvin Sorum, Don Zacher, Emil Barnum, Dale Carlson, Dylan Hempstead, Claire Peterson, Max Swenson, Leland Vetch.
Art Wheaton, Samuel Williams Jr., John Howard Benson, Gregory Clements, Elton Bud Gilo, Gerald Lederber, Robert Bob Lee, Roland Steinfeld, Douglas Eaton, Donald Fort, Beryl Lee, Harold Massell, Adolph Olson, Donald Otis, Wallace Wally Sen, Donald Donnie Tweeten, Betty Vining, Robert Botcher, Margaret Hughes, Alan Rosted, Roger Young, Raymond Barclay, Dale Comstock, Leroy Doctor, Paul Forsythe, Leonard Johnson, Archie Jorgensen, Lester Lemke, Carl Morgan, Ginther Mooley, Michael Rabati, Irvin Smith, Robert Bob Steplug, Larry Thorson, Dennis Todd, Edmund Virock, Timothy Bunkers, Kenneth Carlson, Dwight Colson, David Frank, Edward Ed Kingsley, Warren Munson, Thomas Olson, Lloyd Snow, Adrian Traff, Harley Westby, Alan Barham, Virgil Britson, Ronald Grenier, Burton Paulson, Curtis Swenson, Donald Wall, John Mark, Gladden Sandin, Gifford Scray, Carl Soley, Warren Anderson, Richard Suzuki, Mark Heiser, Hollis Hebner, Robert Bob Hughes, Gerald Jerry Olson, Sidney Rosted, Burns Benson, Larry Braniff, Ralph Deebing, Russell Forsythe, Milton Mickey Meyer, Maynard Palmquist, Lyle Peterson, Wayne Senes, Tina Thorson, Richard Benson, Richard Dick Dittman, Gary Toby Feller, Robert Flynn, Alvin Jimmy Gausted, John Robert Jory, Earl Kitchen, Ralph Lee, Darrell Olson, Bradley Solberg, Harold Van Gundy.
Wallace Peterson, Laurel Benson, Richard Halverson, Thomas Craig, Wilbur Stubby Loken, Arnie Mindrum, Robert Nagel, Ronald Nelson, Paul Runnigan, Jerome Sand, Van Voigt, John Benson, Gerald Jerry Botcher, Clinton Christensen, Arlie Erkey, Burdette Unish, James Owen Benson, David Dave Duffy, Kenneth Ken Gausted, Charles Charlie Carrier, Kenneth Kenny Chapel Sr., John Butch George, Charlie Halverson, Darrell Hughes, Roland Jack Kerrigan, Thomas Tom Runnigan, Gary Sandin, Russell Sather, Donald Don Van Gundy, Terry Virock, David Dave Benson, Kevin Kelleher, Jerry Lee, Laurel Owen, Lowell Onsgard, Gerald Jerry Peterson, Francis Van Gundy, Paul Wheaton, Robert Bob Belangi, Frank Burfield, Larry Eaton, Frederick Fred Hoon, Eugene Lushinsky, Arliss Markegard, Elmo Wojan, Steve Young, John Johnny Beth, Donald Donnie Carlson, Verraine Bud Craig, John Dewey, Ronald Ron Deebing, David Erdman, David Fodness, Joe McManaman, William Dale Ahmet, James Jim Peterson, Ronald Ron Sherry, Gordon Stinson, Lauren Thompson, David Amundsen, Wayne Bestard, Edwin Bolt, James Botcher, Sherman Cole, Alan Bud Fitting, Lauren Mort LaFleur, Clifford Cliff Lewin, William Bill Lynch, Virgil Sherburne, Richard Dick Snow, Junior J.C. Van Gundy, Arden Hargrove, Bob Jansen, Dale Eglin, Merlin Olson, Alan Betts, Terry Osk, Ronald Lewison, Ernest Knutson, Elwood Lee, Alan Larson, Roger Arndt, Neil Christensen, Lowell Kingsler.
And added since last Memorial Day, David Kesey, Tim Orr, Sherman Clay, Larry Grunden, Thomas Nagel, Hal Hetland, Wayne Gordon, Roger Meyer.